Hi everybody, my name is David Gully and I'm at Bentley University, and this is the fourth of 4 videos on the Fed's balance sheet. So in our previous videos, we talked about the Fed's old balance sheet, the fact that they changed their balance sheet through various QE programs. Then we talked about the impact of those QE programs on the economy. And in this video, we will focus on the eventual shrinking of the Fed's balance sheet. And for other videos, please see our YouTube channel. So in the previous video, we looked at the Fed's new improved balance sheet, so to speak. Back in the days of old, the Fed only used to have mostly Treasury bills. So back here, the Fed had a very simple balance sheet made up mostly of Treasury bills and loans to banks. Over time, through the various QE programs and also the maturity extension program, the Fed dramatically increased the size of the balance sheet and also dramatically changed the composition to include now a majority of mortgage-backed securities and longer-term Treasury securities. And so through these 3 rounds of quantitative easing, the Fed roughly quintupled its balance sheet and added new securities to its balance sheet that it didn't used to hold. And the intent, as we saw in just the previous video, was to increase aggregate demand and help the economy recover from the Great Recession. And the Fed has said over and over again that what they want to do is they want to eventually reduce the size of this balance sheet once the economy is on more solid ground. And so here are 5 questions that we're going to consider in this video. So how is the Fed going to reduce their balance sheet? How quickly are they going to do so? Might they stop or reverse the process for any reason? What impact on the economy this might have? And then, well, what's the eventual long-run size of the balance sheet? So first, how is the Fed going to reduce the size of its balance sheet? Well, the Fed went through 3 rounds of quantitative easing, and they ended up stabilizing their balance sheet at around $4.5 trillion. In order to maintain this $4.5 trillion balance sheet value, what they have to do is reinvest proceeds from maturing Treasury securities and maturing mortgage-backed securities, because otherwise, if they did not reinvest these maturing securities, they would run off their balance sheet and the balance sheet would tend to shrink. So every month, the Fed has to reinvest billions and billions of dollars of longer-term Treasuries and mortgage-backed Treasuries and even still Treasury bills, because they hold Treasury bills, of course. And so the idea here is that if the Fed wants to reduce the size of the balance sheet, all they would have to do is slow down the rate at which they reinvest the maturing securities. And so let's suppose, for example, see how this works. Well, imagine that the Fed doesn't reinvest the principal of both a $5,000 mortgage-backed security and a $10,000 Treasury securities. Suppose that these mature and they decide not to reinvest them. Well, on the asset side of the balance sheet, not surprisingly, if they don't reinvest them and they mature, they would disappear off the asset side. On the liability side, what would happen over here? Well, as the mortgage-backed security matures, the principal value would have to be paid off through reductions in deposit facilities or in the checking account balances, and this would reduce bank reserves. The Treasury note, as it matures, the government would pay the Fed the $10,000, the face value, and this would reduce Treasury deposits by $10,000. And so you can see that for the most part, in terms of the size of the balance sheet, letting the maturity or the securities mature has the effect very similar to an open market operation in terms of the size of the balance sheet declines. So if the Fed made an open market sale, it would have a similar impact on the size of the balance sheet. But notice that now when we're dealing with maturing Treasury notes, that there is involvement also of the Treasury deposits on the liability side. So visually, what we would have is something like this. So here, this is what the supply reserves in the reserves market look like pre-QE. So this would be pre-2008. And then post-QE, the supply reserves shifted very far to the right. So now we have a very high supply of reserves. By letting the securities mature and not fully reinvesting them, that will allow the supply of reserves curve to shift to the left, either slowly or quickly, depending on how fast the Fed wants to get the process going. But the bottom line is this: when the Fed allows securities to mature and doesn't reinvest them, the supply of reserves will tend to shift back to the left. So now we want to think about, well, how quickly are they going to reduce the balance sheet? And the way they've announced this, the way they've structured this, they're going to do it very slowly at first and then relatively more quickly. So their current plans are to start the reduction at $6 billion per month of Treasury securities and $4 billion per month of mortgage-backed securities, for, of course, a total of $10 billion per month. And what they intend to do is every 3 months to ramp up those volumes. So every 3 months to increase the volume of Treasuries by $6 billion and to increase the volume of non-reinvestment of mortgage-backs by $4 billion. And the intent is to max out each of those at $30 billion and then $20 billion. So at a maximum, letting $30 billion of Treasuries run off, maximum $20 billion of mortgage-backed securities run off. So, of course, for a combined total of $50. And at the maximum rate, this works out to a $600 billion per year at an annual rate. And the key thing to note here is this is as of early 2017, and the Fed has made it pretty clear that, based on economic conditions, that they might change this schedule. Now, will they reverse or at least stop this process for any reason? Well, it's possible, because what they want to do is they want to have the balance sheet run off in a stable, predictable way in the background, according to Janet Yellen's words. And what we need to keep in mind here, though, is the economy is always subject to shocks. And so if, for example, there was a negative demand shock that was sufficiently large, well, the Fed might pause the reduction, at least for a time. And if the shock was really big, then, well, the Fed might reverse and undergo another QE program, but they really have said they don't want to do this very much. Their intent, as they've said, is they want to put the balance sheet back to a more normal level. So now what we want to think about is, well, okay, now that they're thinking of doing this, if they go ahead and do it, if they start running the balance sheet down, how might this impact the economy? Well, in the previous video, we looked at how the QE programs, in other words, the increase in the size of the balance sheet, how those work to increase aggregate demand through a whole variety of transmission channels. Well, if we reverse QE and let the balance sheet shrink down, that might reduce aggregate demand. Or what the Fed is really hoping here is that this slows the growth of aggregate demand in an expanding economy. So they don't want the aggregate demand curve to shift back to the left. They maybe just want to shift to the right a little bit more slowly. And what they've done is they've announced this planned reduction long in advance, communicated it to the financial markets and the public at large, and then by starting slowly, what they want to do here, and these are Janet Yellen's words, they want it to run very quietly in the background. So our last question we want to address here is, well, what might be the eventual size of the balance sheet? And the general answer is we don't exactly know yet, and the Fed has not been specific. The most specific thing they've said in their announcements is here. They want the reserve securities holdings will continue to decline in a gradual and predictable manner until the committee judges that the Federal Reserve is holding no more securities than necessary to implement monetary policy efficiently and effectively. And so that doesn't give us any clear guidance as to what the final numerical value might be. And there's actually some disagreement in terms of what the value of the Fed's balance sheet ought to be in the long term. There's a number of folks, including former Fed Chair Ben Bernanke, who argues that the Fed's balance sheet ought to remain more elevated than it used to in order to provide extra monetary accommodation. Now here's what we can do, though. We can take sort of a back-of-the-envelope calculation, and we can get a reasonable estimate of what the minimum size of the balance sheet will be going forward. And we can do this based on the liabilities that the Fed has to carry as part of its balance sheet. And so if you look at their liabilities, and this is as of August 2017, you can see that currency in circulation is about $1.6 trillion. Required reserves balance, not total reserves balance, only required reserves, reserves that are required by the Fed, that's about $200 billion. Treasury deposits, in other words, deposits from the federal government who operates through the Federal Reserve, those are about $200 billion. And then various foreign accounts that the Fed maintains for foreign central banks, those are about $250 billion. And then finally, in a previous video, we talked about the ONRRP facility, the overnight reverse repurchase facility. Those show up as liabilities. But two important notes here. The first one is that the Fed is hopeful that they can eventually phase out the reverse repurchase facility, so that wouldn't be there anymore. And moreover, as we saw in a previous video, the net impact on the volume of liabilities of these reverse repos is zero. Even though it changes the composition of the liabilities, the overall net impact is zero. So if you total up these four factors here, they add up to about $2.25 trillion right now. And I'm rounding just a little bit, but not by very much, because remember, this is just a back-of-the-envelope calculation. And so if you look at the rate at which the current plan is expected to reduce the balance sheet by, the current plan pulls us down to that $2.25 trillion level in about 4 years, plus or minus. And what we need to keep in mind, though, is that over time, over the next 4 years, naturally and normally, liabilities would tend to increase. So, for example, currency in circulation will probably rise, actually, from its current $1.6 trillion. As deposits in the banking system rise, required reserve balances will tend to increase from their current $200 billion and so forth. And so $2.25 trillion can be thought of as the absolute dead minimum that the balance sheet might be as of right now, this minute. And what we can do here is we can look at a chart that is from a recent speech by Governor Jerome Powell, and this is charting the proposed or a possible path of the size of the Fed's balance sheet over time. So you can see that right here that it starts from the approximate $4.5 trillion value, and as the balance sheet shrinks down over time, it declines, and it declines about roughly over the next 4 years. And the question is, well, where does it reach its long-run equilibrium? And he has several possible alternative paths here. So notice that one of these possible paths is around the mid 2 trillions, which is pretty close to the back of the envelope calculation we just did. But if you assume higher balances for reserves held in the banking system, you might end up with larger long-run levels of the Fed's balance sheet. But what's critical to note here is that no matter what the path of the Fed's balance sheet is, and no matter the future holdings of the Federal Reserve System, is that the balance sheet, when all is said and done, is going to be substantially larger than it was prior to the Great Recession in 2008. So a quick summary here. So the Fed is going to start normalizing the size of the balance sheet when, in the Fed's words, policy normalization is well underway. The size of the balance sheet will decline by a given amount each month, and they're going to start small and modest at first and then accelerate a little bit over time. These reductions could be paused or reversed if some negative effect hits the economy. And the eventual long-run size of the Fed's balance sheet is not known, but it's going to be substantially larger than the old Fed balance sheet, probably by about an order of 3, so that the minimum size of the balance sheet going forward will be probably at least 3 times the old value of the Fed's balance sheet. Thank you all very much.